Good job. Hey, Brandon.
Hello.
You stole Sydney from me.
I was waiting. I was gonna see how long that was gonna happen. I've been avoiding you for that
Yeah,
reason.
he stole a staff person from me.
Welcome, Brandon. Going live. Good afternoon, y'all.
Thank
Right now in America, even as millions of people are staying in their homes to avoid getting sick, people in Detroit are without running water and being forced to use the same water to cook, clean dishes, and then flush their toilets. That's according to Detroit activist Monica Lewis Patrick, who is part of an organization we call We the People of Detroit. It's not just happening in Detroit, far from it. We're facing the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. Millions of people have lost their jobs and can't pay rent, buy groceries, or make utilities payments, including their monthly water bill. And some utilities are threatening to, or in the case of Detroit, have cut off water to residents who can't pay. Widespread water shutoffs put us at risk of a horrific humanitarian crisis. They also represent a threat to public health. We all know that, as simple as it is, Washing our hands regularly with soap and water is one of the best weapons we have against coronavirus. Denying people access to water in the midst of this crisis will mean more people getting sick. Welcome to The Briefing, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm John Matthews, Senior Legal Counsel at the Justice Collaborative and your host, and I'm excited to join our guests today to talk about the solution to this problem. How do we provide universal access to safe water? Here to talk about that and more is the Congressmember from Michigan's 13th District, Representative Rashida Tlaib, who recently introduced the Emergency Water is a Human Right Act. We also have with us Baltimore City Council President Brandon Scott, who shepherded the Water Accountability and Equity Act through Baltimore City Council unanimously, and Mary Grant, Campaign Director of Public Water for All at Food and Water Watch, which supports universal access to safe water through promoting public water and sewage service provision. Welcome to you all. Representative Tlaib, great to see you again. Thank you for joining us today. Representative Tlaib recently introduced the Emergency Water is a Human Right Act, which would appropriate $1.5 billion to low-income households across states and Native American territories experiencing water access instability due to the pandemic. Your bill calls for an initial $1.5 billion to ensure people with low incomes do not lose access to critical water supplies during the pandemic. Representative Tlaib, why did you introduce this legislation and what would the bill do to help people?
Yeah, so prior to even me getting into the United States Congress, United Nations was here, and advocates like, the late Mama Lila Cabell and others, what we call, water warriors, were on the ground demanding, access to water, making water a human right issue. And now during this global pandemic, it has become evident and even more critical that we access water. I mean, in the same breath that, the governor and others were issuing, notices, please wash your hands and all of these things, a lot of advocates here in Detroit, especially, and folks in Flint, were saying, really, because we don't have access to water and our water sometimes is not even clean. And so it was so critically important that we introduced this. And it's not only just $1.5 billion, but it's also setting up a permanent fix to this issue, because a lot of what we've seen right now, John, is, moratorium on water shut off and moratorium on rent and all these things. But we know when the pandemic is over, those bills are still due. So this would be an actual, direct funding to a lot of the families, some of which owe like a small amount of even $150 are getting their water cut off. And like you said, talking about Monica, I've actually heard from some of my neighbors that, go and borrow water from even their, their next door neighbors to make formula. They're so afraid to even talk about this issue, because what we've seen is when, especially if you're a mom with young children, is that as soon as your water gets cuts off, the Child Protective Services shows up at your door and says, hey, this is negligence, we're going to take your children away. That's how much of a huge impact it has been, again, prior to the pandemic. So you can imagine now during this really huge crisis that we're all facing.
So you often talk about how Congress is sometimes too reactive and not quick enough to really address urgent problems. Can you explain to our viewers, our community out there, why is this urgent? Why is this something worth our attention and engaging?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I mean, I represent the third poorest congressional district. So there's a sense of urgency for so many of my residents who have been continually being asked, wait for $15 minimum wage, wait for Medicare for all, wait for us to deal with the issue around paid sick leave and childcare. Wait is consistently being told to so many of my neighbors, including, again, the most vulnerable, who, no fault of their own in many ways, John. I mean, the cost of water continues to be increased. They're creating quasi-governmental authorities. The water is becoming out of control. Why? Because the lack of action on the part of the federal government and others in infrastructure, the lack of accountability of what you saw in Flint, of moving towards something even more, cost efficient, which later turned out to be contaminated water infested with lead. And again, all of that is to say, many of my colleagues, of course, some of them have now been an awakening of, oh my God, there's 15 million people in our nation right now that have water shut off issues. That's one of 20 Americans, one of 20 of our neighbors across this country that are facing this issue. And I heard there's even a consumer report that came out, Mary could probably talk about this, that this is an issue that's going to actually increase because of this pandemic.
How would the Emergency Water as a Human Right Act solve some of these problems? What are the specific things that it would do? And also, can you talk a little bit about, has there been reception for something like this in Congress?
Yeah, I'm so pleased to tell you all. Leader Schumer just tweeted recently about it. Speaker Pelosi is very much in hope, supportive of having this final language in the next CARES package, relief package. So I'm thrilled to see folks kind of tagging on and saying this is important. And thank you to incredible co-lead partner in Congresswoman Debbie Dingell in Michigan, who also had a front row seat to seeing what this pandemic and this issue on access to water has meant to not only my residents but hers as well. But this is a permanent fix of 1.5 billion, like you said, John. But the way we've been able to deal with like utility shutoff, like your light, your gas, is through programs like LAHEAP. A lot of my residents know this is like a home heating credit. You call, some of the community-based organizations provide that aid. Is that we work directly with would be working directly with low income residents, folks again that have been cut off from water, to getting them support to pay off these bills. Again, not a moratorium, which to me is a Band-Aid, but an actual permanent fix to saying we have to be able to provide aid. And I know Mary and others and Brendan will be talking about this, but there has been movement, advocates have been talking about allowing people with water bills to pay based on their income. I see like Pepsi and Coca-Cola, and actually even here, in Detroit, I've heard of golf courses and stadiums and other folks not paying their water bill on time, but they don't get theirs shut off. But my folks get theirs shut off for $150. So there is this inequity in how we're treating those that have and those that don't. And again, it's so like our lives are online when we don't have access to water. And I think people don't realize, when you see statistics in my district where, overwhelmingly African Americans are dying at a higher rate from COVID, where, again, it's 40% right now in Michigan, John. I mean, 40% of my Black neighbors are died from COVID, where we looking at the rate overall population in Michigan, it's less than 15% of the population. So that tells you that something is wrong. Inequity and racial injustice is there. The structural racism that folks have been talking about is there. And so when Pepsi and Coca-Cola, all these other kinds of industries, the golf course, I heard one time, and again, these billionaires have access to water, even though they're not paying their bills on time. So it's critically important, again, that we talk about direct aid and assistance and having the federal government play a huge role in that.
Yeah, thank you for addressing the inequity and being proximate. And you mentioned Council President Scott. I want to get you involved in this conversation too. You're from Baltimore's 2nd District. Since your election in 2011, you've worked to protect vulnerable communities in Baltimore, including on issues such as justice reform. And you recently helped shepherd water affordability protections through Baltimore City Council. So Council President Scott, what caused you to prioritize water affordability in Baltimore, and how has this pandemic impacted people in Baltimore's ability to access basic utilities like water?
Listen, we have to understand that water is a basic right, something that we need to live. And having affordable, clean water should have never been an issue, but it has been. And you look at the history of the Department of Public Works here in Baltimore, it has a horrid history of water shutoffs in certain communities. As the Congresswoman pointed out, we've had places here, we found out that the new Ritz-Carlton development that was built here in 2007 has never received a water bill. All of these kind of inequities, when you talk about a city like Baltimore, that's the birthplace of housing redlining via legislation, we know how deep our inequities run. And when you're talking about a service and a basic thing that people need, this is why I knew this piece of legislation, the Water Accountability and Equity Act, was actually introduced by my predecessor, who then his Department of Public Works, once he became mayor, tried to kill this bill. But we unanimously passed this bill because doing this was the right thing to do, working with our water coalition, working with those community advocates, because we knew, like Philadelphia, who passed this in 2017, that creating an income-based water billing system was the best thing for Baltimore. And COVID-19 has just exacerbated all of those kind of inequities, because we know who's struggling. We know that our Black and our brown neighborhoods are the ones that are being impacted the most by COVID, via contraction, via death, but also the economic impact. So having this legislation getting ready to go into full swing is more important now than ever.
Can you talk a little bit about what the legislation does for our viewers?
Yeah. So this legislation here, the Water Accountability and Equity Act, creates a system of tiered credits, which would ensure residents earning between 0 and 200% of the federal poverty line receive water bills that they actually can afford, right? Which is critically important. If you're using the calculation formula, a family of 4 with an annual income of $25,000 and an annual water bill of roughly $860 will receive an annual credit of $110 to be done over 12 billing cycles. An individual making $12,000 with the same water bill will receive a credit of $620. It also establishes something very critical, a pathway for households to get out of water debt by allowing each monthly payment made through the program to also count towards their unpaid water debt. For example, if I pay $80 on my water bill and my water bill is paid in full, $80 will also be credited towards the household's unpaid water debt, right? This debt is also deferred for all enrollees, so the households do not need to make additional payments on a payment plan to repay existing water debt. It will also improve the dispute resolution process, something that we continuously have went through in Baltimore City. Actually, since being on the council in 2011, water bill issues are the top issue. Even in a city like Baltimore, we have significant violent crime issues. Water bills are the number one thing because people, it's a system that they have not been able to make affordable, have not been able to bill correctly. Even during COVID, we had some problems with them sending out bills. So we will make this resolution process and make it easier. So when people believe they get an erroneous bill, making a process more transparent and solutions oriented. And it also, very critical portion, it creates the office of the customer advocate, which will address billing issues in a standardized and open dispute process available to all customers. And the last thing I want to mention is that it will also make water affordable for all Baltimoreans by ensuring that no resident in Baltimore is paying more than 3% of their monthly income on water.
And John, one of the things that we know is Americans this year are going to be paying an average of $104 per month in water and wastewater. And, people don't understand it's also sewage and water that's all tagged on top of, the access to water. And I mean, just even reading that it's up to more than 30% of increase over the last decade. I mean, it just continues, again, becoming increasingly more unaffordable, even though our cost of living is increasing. Folks are still being paid at lower wage, but also, it actually is expensive to be poor in our country right now. And we haven't been able to tackle on some of those economic divides. And again, people are getting cut from water for as low as $150. So I think what the council president is talking about is absolutely around affordability, but we need really talking about completely cutting all the barriers that are accessible. Again, water is so essential to live, even beyond this pandemic. And we need to really have a real conversation about how do we truly just, again, make it accessible to everyone. I mean, I see my state, Michigan, John, you should look, Nestle pays very little, a for-profit entity of access to our public water. The Great Lakes, they take so much of our public resources, again, for just a little bit of money that we could probably be, using those kinds of resources to get accessing water to many of our residents that we represent. So I think it's really critically important that people understand the bigger picture here of this was a crisis before the pandemic, and now we're seeing, again, what doing nothing looks like when a pandemic hits us.
And John, I just want to add, the Congressman brought up earlier about how we've had some places in some parts of the country where they're privatized like the water. That's something that we also stopped here in Baltimore. We passed a charter amendment making that our water system could not be privatized, because we know what happens when you put the basic needs of any citizen, of any citizenry in the hands of private folks. They do not do things the right way. So we have to make sure that we are keeping these kind of programs in the hands of the public, making sure that they're more equitable, making sure that they're impacting the people that need it the most and not just ignoring. Listen, it's embarrassing that when you think about stadiums, Nestle, big corporations who are paying nothing or a small water bill, but my grandmother gets a $400 and $500 water bill when she's barely at home, right? Like these kind of things cannot continue to go on. That's why these systems have to be rebuilt and rebuilt the right way.
And thank you so much for both of you, working on these issues both locally and in Congress. I'd like to bring in Mary Grant, who's also been working on these issues and I think can provide some more insight on what people are dealing with. So Mary Grant from Food and Water Watch, she's been waging a nationwide campaign to prevent water shutoffs at the local level. Mary, can you please talk about what you're seeing around the country and what people are up against and how successful you've been in stopping some of these water shutoffs?
Well, thanks so much for the question and for this conversation, John. The response across the country is pretty encouraging so far, but so much more needs to be done. So the global pandemic has really shined a spotlight on some of the dark underbelly of some of our basic systems, from healthcare to water. Some people are surprised that water shutoffs ever occur. And it is shocking because water is a necessity for life. And it is always, always an injustice that a person is denied water over an inability to pay their bills. Our national survey from a few years ago found that the average utility shut off about 5% of households a year. So that's 15 million people across the country each year losing basic water service. We've heard about mass shutoffs in Detroit, especially the mass disconnects that happened under emergency management when they lost local control. But our survey found that Detroit wasn't the worst. The highest shutoffs were in the South, Tulsa, Oklahoma, New Orleans, where nearly 1 in 5 families lost running water. So now as we're facing the threat of COVID-19 with millions of people laid off and wondering how to make rent and pay their utilities, we need to make sure that everyone has running water at home. So this is why in early March, we called for a nationwide water shutoff moratorium with service restoration for all. Thanks to Representative Tlaib, We the People of Detroit, People's Water Board in Detroit, Michigan Welfare Rights Organization, and all the grassroots groups in Detroit. Detroit was actually one of the first cities that promised to not only stop shutoffs, but to restore service to people who are disconnected. We also called on all the top 10 cities from our survey with the most shutoffs in the country to suspend disconnects and restore service. The good news is by mid-March, all of these communities have stopped shutoffs. We're also calling on governors to step up and protect their states. Governors have broad executive powers when they declare states of emergency, and they can order your utility to keep the water on. So to date, 15 states, Washington, D.C., and more than 650 localities have suspended water shutoffs. This is protecting 210 million people across the country. That's 64% of the US population, which is amazing. But more than a third of the country remains unprotected, and many of these moratoriums are expiring, particularly in the South. Several in Florida and Texas have expired at the end of last month. And we've heard from folks in Tennessee, Louisiana, Missouri, who are living without water right now. In Tennessee, a woman reached out. She and her husband, they're seniors with disabilities, have been living without water for 4 years. She previously went to her son's house to bathe, wash their clothes, but she couldn't do that with the stay-at-home order. And she's been using a barrel to collect rainwater for washing and bathing. She's called everyone, but she can't get any help. So while we're making great progress, we need to make sure that no one is left behind and without water. I want to thank Representative Tlaib for her leadership, because we do need Congress to pass a national moratorium on water shutoffs today. Everyone deserves water.
Thank you, Mary. Do you have any tips or strategies? We have a lot of organizers and advocates that are watching right now. Anything that's worked well for you in advocating for this issue nationally?
Sure, we have an organizing toolkit. So feel free to reach out to Food and Water Watch. We can connect you. We have a toolkit for how we're calling on step up right now to take that immediate action to stop shutoffs, restore service, and waive all late fees and penalties. So you can use media, you can use calls to your governor's office. I mean, calls are super effective. Just call them so that you demand this. Pull together organizations, coalitions of people, sign on letters, pressure, use the media, get pressure on them. They need to be front and center to make sure that they're doing the right thing. So definitely reach out to us at Food and Water Watch, and we'll help you and connect you with some of our tools. And digital tools, online organizing. We're not calling for rallies right now.
Well, I would also, and top of what kind of Mary said, I know for us in Detroit, we created our own media. If it wasn't just Monica or Mama Lila, all these incredible advocates on the ground, that would literally go tell the stories themselves, and then the media would catch on to it. But one of the key things is sharing the truth of what it means to live without water, which is very hard sometimes. You know, we just recently did a call out, you know, even though there has been a moratorium, there's still 3,000, and we think it's more, of folks here in Detroit that still don't have access to water. You know, they're subcontracting this work out. There's a lot of, you know, lack of accountability and transparency in that process. We still can't get a direct answer from the city about the exact number of people that have been disconnected, which is, you know, just taken aback. And that's why our bill is so focused on directly working with families versus these quasi-governmental water authorities, these public utility folks that really haven't showed a good faith of working with community on these issues. But, you know, John, I remember a story that was really profound. It was a few years ago when we were dealing with this fight, even with before the pandemic, there was this outbreak of just a huge amount of folks getting hepatitis C in parts of Detroit, where you saw that that there was higher rates of water shutoff during that time. And it was a story of an elderly couple that would take the snow. We'd get tons of snow in Michigan, and they gathered the snow and let it melt, John. And they would use that snow, that melted snow that turned into water, to flush their toilet, to even wash clothes. Even that story that right here in the richest country in the world, that you have people that poor that can't afford access to a basic right of water. And, you know, even as we talk about this, people say, well, you know, they should be paid. You know, you get these folks, and then I tell them what Nestle is doing, which is every facility they go to, they're just paying $200 access to public water. They made off of our money $343 million in sales of bottled water. So, you know, this, you see it happening in all structures. You see them, these corporate interests coming and trying to make our education system into a for-profit scheme. Our incarceration system now is mass incarceration is a for-profit scheme. And now they're trying to take one of these basic rights and turning it into a for-profit scheme of taking our water and charging people, and these quasi-governmental authorities that have been created. You know, I always tell folks, look at your bill. It went from Department of Water and Sewage to, you know, the water authority, and look at who's on these authorities, look who's actually benefiting from this. And so it is important, as you think about organizing on the ground, that you speak the truth about these systems and that you share these stories. And sometimes the media won't show up, but boy, if you start creating your own media, it will push the real narrative of what happens when you cut people, human beings, off of water.
That's exactly right. And that story about melting the snow, I mean, I can't even imagine what that must be like. It's shameful. Brandon, sorry, Council President Scott, I know you deal with, you know, local people every day. How have you dealt with the accountability piece and balancing, ensuring that your residents have the most basic resources with, you know, making sure you have like a functioning economy, and I'm sure you get hit from all sides, right? Like, how have you balanced that and thought about just you know, some of these issues and making sure your residents are whole?
Well, listen, I think that, listen, when you think about, again, for me, a few years ago, actually, I passed a Baltimore's equity assessment program that's going to now force the city to government to every single thing we do, operational budget, capital budget, every program, every practice that we do, to be done through a lens of racial, gender, and economic equity, because that's the only way that we're going to hold these city agencies responsible and accountable to undo the years of purposeful disinvestment in those neighborhoods. And we're looking forward to now, starting with this upcoming budget, to see that fully implemented. But also, it's about passing these kind of pieces of legislation and then also using the power of the council to hold those agencies responsible. We actually just last week had a informational hearing about the implementation of this bill and things that we wanted to see and make sure that they're trying to maintain what they have going on. We consistently bring in the Department of Public Works to see where they are, how they're benefiting people, why aren't they getting water bills out. One of the most powerful things that you have, the most powerful thing you have, John, as a legislator, is your vote. And when we were voting a few years ago to reappoint the now former Department of Public Works Director, I voted no. When they voted a 14-1 vote, when they voted to give him a raise, I voted no. And I stood on the floor of the council chambers and said, where I come from, where people are losing their water at that, you know, where people have struggled to not get water, struggle with these high water bills, you don't get reappointed when your job wasn't done correctly. You definitely don't get a raise. And that's what we have to do, is making sure that we're passing policy and passing action that lasts longer than us being elected, but that also we're unafraid to do those right things, even if it's unpopular at the time, because we do what's in the best interest of those who are most impacted. And we know in a city like Baltimore, in a city like Detroit, in a city like Flint, who's been impacted by these criminal acts essentially over the period of time, and we have to stop it right now.
Definitely, and thank you so much. I mean, city council is so important, the local level, those decisions directly impact people's lives every day, so thank you for that. I'd like to bring in some polling, as we always do. I'd like to bring in some polling from the Justice Collaborative Institute and Data for Progress, which shows almost 9 in 10 voters support a ban on utility shutoffs or late fees. So this, to me, doesn't seem like a super controversial issue. I just think, we need to make sure we're honest and strategize about how to make sure all of our elected officials understand, what people are dealing with every day. Some people who are out of work have been forced to delay paying bills, which can lead to large late fees, even with only a few days delay. We've already discussed that. I'd also like to transition and talk a little bit about, the environmental piece. So, Representative Tlaib, you mentioned Flint earlier, and I know most people have that background, but I'd like you to talk a little bit about the environmental piece, and also potentially bring in so that our community understands, like, you talk about Native American tribes and territories. Can you talk about like why these areas are sometimes very susceptible to problems accessing clean water, and also how these communities are going to deal with it, and what the federal government can do to help? Sorry, that was many questions. So you could.
No, it's great. I'm so glad you brought into this room, virtually or not, Indian country. I mean, one of the things that I hear from my sister in service, Deb Holland, is how the access of water in Native American tribes and just all over the country have really been hit hardest about lack of access to water and clean water. And so I, want to try to center us on that. Environmental injustice, much of which is really environmental racism, bottled up in there, is the fact that corporate greed is a disease in our country. And a lot of the decisions you saw in Flint, where, even to this day, I explain to people what happened in Flint. Similar to Detroit, you had emergency manager come in there, basically take local. I mean, somebody like Council President Brandon, who's there trying to create oversight and everything. They wiped out that kind of self-determination and an elected body that speaks for the residents, and put I call him accountant, it's usually a he, and that person was making decisions based on numbers and not on need, not on quality. And that's what happened in Flint. They shifted the water resources away from Detroit water, where they were getting our water clean, into a different body of water that was fully contaminated. And the worst part of it all was, y'all, when they figured it out, when they hid it for so long, and they finally, I think with public outcry and grassroots help and creating our own media, because people were showing pictures of their, water that was discolored, it was brown. People were saying, believe me, even though we had even the president at the time drinking the water, everything's great, just everything's fine. People pushed back and said, no, something's wrong here. You can almost taste it. You can almost, and people started seeing a huge influx of children being in high levels of lead. One of the things that came about was, well, this emergency manager made that decision based on those numbers. And when they tried to switch it, they didn't treat those pipes correctly, and tried to switch it back to Detroit, but it was too late, because again, they didn't put the care into treating those pipes. Again, now the infrastructure in itself, not the water as much, is completely contaminated and compromised. And so people say Flint's over. It's not. It's far from over. People in Flint to this day do not have access to water, nor is it clean, and they still have water bills. That's the absurdity of it. They're still paying for water that is not clean. And so it's so critically important, again, that we understand that this crisis, again, before the pandemic, continues to just be prevalent in so many of these communities. I know in Detroit, we continue to show up to these, water meetings, continue to demand, answers to a lot of questions of how people get cut off. A lot of these, again, a lot of these broken systems that we have in place has resulted in so many people falling more into poverty. I mean, John, when you talked about people, the statistic that you talked about, people not being able to pay water, did you know at one point here in this state, if you didn't pay your water, it got tagged onto your property taxes? And then that included 18% interest rate fees. I mean, it just was piled and piled on. We don't do that to corporations. We don't pull them and drag them more into poverty and more into despair. We don't do the same kind of, I think, aggressive kind of assault onto people that, we just don't do it the same way. But yeah, it is really great to see 60 plus members of Congress are now in support of this legislation. Speaker Pelosi wants to see it in the next package. I think again, if it wasn't for the grassroots help and people on the ground demanding it. What I love about We the People and the Water Warriors, and Mary will tell you, John, we have folks in Highland Park right next to Detroit and other corners of the community. They're still delivering water. They are out there during this pandemic delivering water. And the state at this point is just giving us the tank of water to fill up to get water to our neighbors and residents who have been cut off from water. That's the state of our world right now, as people are taking it into their own hands and saying, we're going to get the water to people if government's not going to be about people.
Yeah, and I love that point. Around the country, people are out helping their neighbors. And I think, at a moment where there's a lot of distrust of government, you guys are connecting to people, connecting to organizers, making sure people have basic resources. And I appreciate you for that. Thank you for coming on. I know you guys have very busy days because you're working to help people. But I just want to say thank you for explaining why we should not take access to clean water for granted, and proposing and acting on solutions to help our brothers and sisters who struggle to access this basic resource. For our community of viewers out there, thank you. We appreciate the work you're doing in your communities. We're all in this together. Please join us, The Appeal and Now This again tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for another episode of The Briefing with Representative Katie Porter from California's 45th Congressional District. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Okay.